"Mama's coming home soon," she told the children. But the telegram in her pocket said something else entirely. The dust had barely settled from Tommy Fletcher's horse when Mary Catherine knew her life was about to break in two. She stood on the front porch of their small wooden house, watching the boy's thin frame disappear back down the dirt road that connected their little corner of nowhere to the rest of the world. The yellow paper in her hands felt heavier than iron. Tuesday mornings in Millfield were usually quiet. The kind of quiet that let a woman hear her own heartbeat while she hung wet clothes on the line. The kind of quiet that made Emma's giggle from the chicken coop sound like church bells. But this Tuesday morning carried something different in the air. Something that made the prairie grass bend lower and the sky seem wider and more empty than usual. Mary Catherine's fingers trembled as she unfolded the telegram. The words were typed in those cold, black letters that never seemed to carry any warmth, no matter what they said. But these words carried ice. They carried the weight of mountains. They carried the end of everything she had built her life around. Regret to inform stop Samuel McAllister killed in mine collapse yesterday. Stop body, recovered stop arrangements, pending stop condolences stop, she read it once. Then twice. Then a third time, as if the letters might rearrange themselves into something that made sense. Something that didn't tear the ground out from under her feet. But the words stayed the same. Samuel was dead. Her Samuel, with his gentle hands and his way of humming while he worked. Samuel, who kissed her forehead every morning before he left for the mines. Samuel, who wrote her letters full of promises about coming home soon with enough silver to buy them a bigger house, maybe even some land. The paper fell from her hands and landed on the porch boards with a sound softer than a whisper. She watched it for a moment, this small square of yellow that held the power to destroy everything. Then she picked it up and folded it carefully, pressing the creases until they were sharp as knife edges. From the yard came the sound of her children's voices, bright and careless as birdsong. 8-year-old Jacob was chasing the chickens with a stick, trying to herd them back toward their coop. Little Emma, barely 5, was sitting in the dirt making patterns with stones she had collected from the creek. And baby Ruth, not quite 2, was clapping her hands at everything that moved, her chubby face split wide with that kind of joy that only babies know. They had no idea that their world had just ended. Mary Catherine pressed the telegram against her chest and felt her heart beating underneath it. How do you tell children that their papa is never coming home? How do you take away the light in their eyes and replace it with the kind of sadness that changes a person forever? She had been married to Samuel for 9 years, and in all that time, she had never faced a problem she couldn't solve with hard work and prayer. But this wasn't a problem. This was a canyon that had opened up beneath her feet, and she didn't know how to build a bridge across it. The sun climbed higher, and the morning heat began to press down on everything. Mary Catherine could feel sweat gathering under her collar, mixing with the tears that had started falling without her permission. She wiped her face with her apron and tried to think of what Samuel would want her to do. He always said she was the strongest person he knew, stronger than the mountains, he used to tell her when she worried about money or the children getting sick. But strength felt like a word from another language now. Emma looked up from her stone patterns and waved. "Mama, come see what I made." Mary Catherine's throat closed up tight. She managed to wave back, but the simple gesture felt like lifting a boulder. Her little girl's face was so bright, so full of trust. Emma still believed that the world was a safe place where mamas and papas came home for supper and tucked you into bed with stories. She still believed that tomorrow would be just like today, only maybe a little better. Jacob had given up chasing chickens and was now trying to climb the old oak tree that grew beside the house. Samuel had built a swing on one of its branches the summer before, and sometimes in the evenings he would push all 3 children on it, one at a time, while Mary Catherine watched from the porch. The rope was still there, hanging empty and still in the breathless air. "Jacob, be careful," Mary Catherine called, and her voice sounded almost normal, almost like the voice of a woman whose husband was still alive. The boy waved down at her from the lowest branch. "I'm going to climb all the way to the top, Mama. Then I can see if Papa's coming home." The words hit her like a physical blow. She doubled over, her hand pressed to her mouth to keep the sob from escaping. Jacob was always looking for his father's return. Every evening, he would stand at the gate and watch the road until the sun went down. Every morning, he would ask if today was the day Papa would come back from the mines. Mary Catherine straightened slowly, breathing deep through her nose until the wave of grief passed. She tucked the telegram into her apron pocket, where it settled against her hip like a stone. The children needed her to be strong. They needed her to keep their world steady until she could figure out how to tell them. It had cracked right down the middle. Baby Ruth had crawled over to the porch steps and was trying to pull herself up. Mary Catherine bent down and scooped her daughter into her arms, breathing in that sweet baby smell of milk and sunshine. Ruth's tiny fingers tangled in her hair, and she babbled something that might have been mama or might have been nonsense. It didn't matter. The sound of it was like a balm on her burning heart. Mama sat. Emma had appeared beside the porch, her small face creased with worry. Mary Catherine looked down at her daughter and saw Samuel's eyes looking back at her. The same deep brown, the same kindness. She forced her lips into something that felt like a smile. Just tired, baby girl. Just a little tired. Emma nodded solemnly, the way children do when they accept an adult's explanation, even though they can sense there's more to the story. She went back to her stones, but Mary Catherine could feel her glancing up every few moments, watching. The morning stretched on, and with each passing minute, the telegram seemed to grow heavier in her pocket. She tried to go about her regular tasks. She fed the chickens and gathered the eggs. She swept the porch and started a pot of beans for dinner. She changed Ruth's diaper and combed the tangles out of Emma's hair. Normal things, the kind of things she did every day. But nothing felt normal anymore. Every familiar task felt like she was play-acting in her own life. Every word she spoke to the children felt like a lie, even when she was just telling them to wash their hands or stay out of the mud. Because underneath everything, pressing against her ribs like a physical weight, was the knowledge that their father was dead and they didn't know it yet. By noon, the heat was fierce enough to drive them all inside. Mary Catherine made corn cakes and sliced apples for lunch, and they sat around the small wooden table where she and Samuel had shared so many meals. His empty chair seemed to loom larger than usual, casting shadows that hadn't been there yesterday. "When's Papa coming home?" Jacob asked around a mouthful of corn cake. The question hit her fresh each time, like a slap that never lost its sting. Mary Catherine set down her own untouched food and looked at her son's hopeful face. "Soon," she heard herself say. "Papa's coming home soon." The lie tasted bitter as medicine, but she swallowed it along with everything else. She watched her children eat their lunch and chatter about their plans for the afternoon, and she memorized every detail. The way Emma hummed while she chewed. The way Jacob swung his legs under the table. The way baby Ruth smeared apple on her cheeks and laughed at the mess. She memorized it all because she knew this might be the last meal they would share in innocence. Tomorrow, or maybe tonight, she would have to find the words that would change everything. She would have to take these bright, trusting faces and teach them about grief. She would have to explain that sometimes good men die in dark places far from home, and all the love in the world can't bring them back. But not yet. For now, she could let them believe that Papa was working hard in the mines, counting the days until he could come home. For now, she could carry this terrible knowledge alone, like a stone she had swallowed that was slowly sinking toward her heart. The telegram crinkled softly in her pocket every time she moved, a sound like dry leaves or old bones. But the children were too busy being children to notice, and Mary Catherine was grateful for their noise, their laughter, their beautiful, fragile ignorance of how quickly everything could fall apart. As the afternoon shadows began to lengthen, she knew that evening would come, and with it, the moment when she would have to decide whether to keep lying or start telling the truth that would break all their hearts. The sun was bleeding red across the western sky when Mary Catherine began setting the table for supper. Her hands moved without thought, placing the same chipped plates in the same spots they had occupied every evening for years. 4 plates. for forks, for cups. The routine was so deep in her bones that she didn't realize what she was doing until she found herself standing behind Samuel's chair, her fingers resting on the worn wooden back where his shoulders had leaned countless times before. The chair looked different in the evening light. Empty in a way it had never been empty before, even during the long months when Samuel worked at the mines. There had always been the promise of his return, the certainty that this seat would be filled again with his gentle presence, his quiet way of listening to the children's chatter about their day. Now it stood like a monument to something that would never be again. Emma appeared at her elbow, having crept up silent as a cat. The little girl had a gift for moving without sound, something that usually made Mary Catherine smile. Tonight, it made her heart jump like a spooked horse. "Mama, why does Papa's chair look so lonely?" The question hung in the air between them like smoke. Mary Catherine stared down at her daughter's upturned face, at those trusting brown eyes that held no knowledge of loss or grief. Emma was still young enough to believe that loneliness was something that could be fixed with a hug or a story, or maybe just by asking the right questions. "Papa's working late tonight, baby girl. The chair's just waiting for him, like we are." The words came out easier than they should have. That was the terrible thing about lies. Once you started telling them, they grew smoother on your tongue. They learned to sound like truth, even when they were burning holes in your chest. Emma nodded and skipped back to where she had been playing with her cornhusk doll, apparently satisfied with the explanation. But Mary Catherine noticed how the child glanced back at the empty chair every few moments, as if she were trying to solve a puzzle that didn't quite make sense. The beans had been simmering all afternoon, filling the small house with the warm smell of supper. Mary Catherine had added some of the salt pork that Samuel had brought home from his last trip, back when the world still made sense. The meat would stretch the meal and give the children something solid in their bellies. She mixed up cornbread batter with practiced hands, but her mind kept wandering to that yellow paper folded in her pocket. Every time she moved, she could hear it whisper against the fabric of her dress. Such a small sound, but it seemed louder than thunder in her ears. She wondered if the children could hear it too. She wondered if guilt had a smell, if sorrow left marks that showed on a person's face like bruises. Jacob came in from the yard with dirt under his fingernails and grass stains on his knees. He had been working in the small garden they kept behind the house, pulling weeds and checking on the tomato plants the way Samuel had taught him. The boy took his responsibilities seriously, especially when his father wasn't home to help with the work. "The tomatoes are getting big, Mama," he said, washing his hands in the basin by the door. "Papa's going to be real proud when he sees them." Another knife in her heart. Another weight added to the growing pile of things she would have to explain somehow when the time came. Samuel had been so excited about those tomatoes. He had spent hours that last weekend before he left, showing Jacob how to tie the mistakes and when to pinch off the extra shoots. "I'm sure he will be," Mary Catherine managed, her voice steady as stone. She served the food while the children gathered around the table. Baby Ruth needed to be lifted into her high chair, where she immediately began banging her spoon against the wooden tray and calling Dada, Dada, in her clear, sweet voice. The sound made Mary Catherine's knees weak, but she held herself upright through sheer force of will. They sat in their usual places, Mary Catherine at the foot of the table, Jacob and Emma on either side, baby Ruth in her chair, and Samuel's seat at the head empty and waiting. The beans steamed in their bowls, and the cornbread was golden and warm, split open with butter melting into the cracks. It should have been a perfect family meal, the kind that made a house feel like a home. Instead, it felt like a play being performed for an audience that couldn't see the actors' true faces. Emma picked at her food, her small brow furrowed with concentration. "Mama, your eyes look all red. Are you sick?" Mary Catherine touched her cheek instinctively, feeling the tender skin around her eyes that must have been swollen from the tears she had tried so hard to hide. She had washed her face with cold water from the well, but grief left marks that went deeper than soap could reach. "Just tired, sweetie. I've been working hard today." Jacob looked up from his beans, studying her face with the sharp attention of a child who noticed more than adults usually gave him credit for. At 8, he was old enough to sense when something wasn't right, even if he couldn't name what it was. "You sure, Mama? You've been acting strange all day." Kind of like when Emma was real sick that time, and you kept looking worried. The comparison made Mary Catherine's chest tighten. Jacob had been only 6 when Emma had caught that fever that had burned through her for 3 terrifying days. Mary Catherine had barely slept, sitting beside the bed and praying to every saint she could remember. The fear had marked her then, and apparently it was marking her now. "I'm fine, Jacob. Just thinking about Papa and hoping he's safe in those mines." It wasn't exactly a lie. She was thinking about Samuel, though not in the way she let the children believe. She was remembering the way he looked when he left 2 months ago, how he had kissed each of them goodbye and promised to write letters. She was thinking about how he had held her close that last morning and whispered that he loved her more than all the silver in Colorado. She was thinking about how she would never feel his arms around her again, never hear him humming while he shaved, never watch him teach Jacob how to be a man, or see him dance with Emma in the kitchen after supper. She was thinking about 1,000 small moments that were gone forever, buried under tons of rock and earth in a place she had never seen. Baby Ruth threw her spoon on the floor and reached her chubby arms towards Samuel's empty chair, babbling something that sounded urgent and important in the language only she understood. "Dada. Dada coming." The innocence in that question nearly broke Mary Catherine in two. Ruth was too young to understand absence in any permanent way. In her small world, people who went away always came back eventually. Papa had gone away before and returned with presents and stories and kisses for everyone. There was no reason to think this time would be any different. "Papa's working, baby girl," Mary Catherine said, her voice thick with the effort of keeping it steady. "He's working hard so he can come home to us." She lifted Ruth's spoon from the floor and wiped it clean, then helped guide it back to the child's eager hands. The simple act of feeding her daughter felt monumental, like she was holding on to something essential and fragile that might slip away if she wasn't careful. The meal continued in a strange mixture of normal conversation and terrible silence. Emma chattered about the butterfly she had seen in the garden. Jacob asked if he could stay up late to work on the wooden horse he was carving with his father's knife. Ruth made happy noises and smeared beans in her hair, the way babies did when the world was exactly as it should be. Mary Catherine watched them eat and listened to their voices, memorizing every word and gesture. She knew that tomorrow, or the day after, or maybe next week when she finally found the courage, everything would change. They would still sit around this table, but it would never feel the same. The empty chair would stop being a place where Papa might sit and become a reminder of loss that would follow them for the rest of their lives. For now, though, she could give them this. One more meal where Papa was just working late. One more evening where their biggest worry was whether they could have seconds on cornbread. One more night where they could fall asleep believing that their father would walk through the door any day, tired and dusty from the mines, but alive and whole and ready to hear about everything they had done while he was gone. The candle in the center of the table flickered, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Samuel had made that candle holder from a piece of driftwood he found by the creek back when they first moved to this place. His hands had shaped it. His breath had blown away the wood shavings. His smile had lit up when he showed it to her for the first time. Everything in this house carried his fingerprints, his laughter, his love. How do you tell children that all of that has become memory in the space of a single telegram? As the last light faded from the windows and the evening sounds of crickets began their nightly chorus, Mary Catherine knew that bedtime was approaching. Soon she would tuck them in and kiss their foreheads and listen to their prayers where they asked God to keep Papa safe and bring him home soon. She would sit in the darkness afterward, alone with the truth that pressed against her ribs like a living thing. But morning would come, as it always did, and with it would come more questions, more moments when she would have to choose between protecting their innocence and preparing them for a world that was harder and sadder than they knew. Mary Catherine had not slept. She had lain in the bed she had shared with Samuel for 9 years, staring at the ceiling boards that he had nailed in place with his own hands, listening to the house settle and creak around her like old bones. The telegram sat on the bedside table, unfolded now, its yellow surface catching what little moonlight came through the thin curtains. She had read it so many times that she could recite the words without looking. Regret to inform stop, Samuel McAllister killed stop. Each word was burned in her mind like a brand on cattle, marking her forever as a woman whose husband would not be coming home. When the first pale light began to creep across the eastern sky, she knew the time for lies had passed. The secret had grown too heavy to carry another day. It was pressing against her chest like a stone, making it hard to breathe, hard to think, hard to be the mother her children needed her to be. She rose before the sun was fully up and dressed in the same clothes she had worn yesterday, her fingers fumbling with buttons that felt foreign under her touch. Everything felt different now. The floorboards under her feet, the way her dress hung on her shoulders, even the air she breathed seemed thinner and colder than it had been before she knew Samuel was dead. The children were still sleeping. Emma curled up like a kitten in the small bed she shared with baby Ruth, her corn-husk doll clutched tight against her chest. Jacob sprawled across his narrow cot, one arm hanging over the edge, his face peaceful in a way that only sleep could make it. They looked so young in the morning light, so fragile and trusting. In a few hours, she would have to teach them about loss. Mary Catherine made coffee with hands that shook only a little and sat at the kitchen table as the sun climbed higher. She watched the light move across the walls, the same light that had warmed this room every morning for the 5 years they had lived here. Samuel had built this kitchen with lumber he had hauled from town, planing each board smooth with his own hands. He had cut the window himself, saying he wanted his wife to see the sunrise while she cooked breakfast for their family. The irony of it now was almost more than she could bear. He had given her this window so she could watch the light come into the world each day, and now she was going to use that same light to break their children's hearts. Emma was the first awake, padding into the kitchen in her white nightgown, her hair tangled from sleep. She climbed onto Mary Catherine's lap without asking, the way she did every morning, and settled against her mother's chest like she belonged there. "Morning, Mama," she said, her voice still thick with dreams. "Good morning, baby girl." Mary Catherine held her daughter close, breathing in the sweet smell of her hair, memorizing the weight of this small body against her own. In a few minutes, Emma would learn that the world was not the safe place she believed it to be. She would learn that papas could die far from home, that love was not always enough to keep people safe, that sometimes bad things happen to good families for no reason at all. Jacob appeared next, rubbing sleep from his eyes. He was wearing the shirt that Samuel had brought him from his last trip home, blue cotton with pearl buttons that made the boy feel grown up and important. He looked so much like his father in the morning light that Mary Catherine's throat closed up tight. "Is Papa home yet?" was the first thing out of his mouth, the same question he asked every morning. Mary Catherine's heart cracked a little more. "Come sit with me, Jacob. Both of you come sit." Something in her voice made the children look at her more closely. Emma pulled back to study her mother's face, those brown eyes that were so like Samuel's growing wide with concern. Jacob's smile faded, replaced by the careful attention of a child who had learned to read the signs of trouble. "What's wrong, Mama?" Emma asked, her small hand touching Mary Catherine's cheek. Baby Ruth woke then, calling from her crib in the bedroom, her voice bright and cheerful as birdsong. Mary Catherine went to get her, lifting the warm bundle of baby softness and carrying her back to the kitchen where Jacob and Emma waited at the table, their faces solemn in the growing light. She sat down with Ruth on her lap and looked at her 3 children, these pieces of her heart that walked around in the world on their own legs. "How did you tell them that their father was never coming home? How did you take away their innocence and replace it with knowledge too heavy for such small shoulders?" "I need to tell you something about Papa," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. The words felt like stones in her mouth, rough and hard to swallow. Emma's hand found Jacob's across the table, some instinct telling her that whatever was coming would require holding on to each other. "You know, Papa's been working in the mines in Colorado. You know, he's been gone a long time, working hard to earn money for our family." They nodded, their faces expectant, waiting for news of his return. "Yesterday, A telegram came. A message about Papa. She reached into her apron pocket and pulled out the yellow paper, handling it like it might burn her fingers. The children stared at it as if they could read the terrible words written there, as if they already knew what it was going to tell them. Papa was in an accident at the mine. The tunnel fell down, and Papa was caught underneath. Emma's face crumpled like paper thrown in the fire. Is he hurt bad, Mama? Is he coming home to get better? The hope in her voice was like a knife twisting in Mary Catherine's chest. She looked at her daughter's tear-filled eyes and knew there was no gentle way to say what needed to be said. Papa died, baby girl. He can't come home anymore. The words fell into the kitchen like stones dropped into still water, sending ripples of silence and shock through the morning light. Emma began to cry then, not the loud wailing of a tantrum, but the quiet, heartbroken tears of a child who was learning for the first time that love could not keep the people you needed safe. Jacob sat perfectly still, his face pale as winter sky. At 8, he was old enough to understand death, to know that it meant forever and never and no more. But he was also young enough to think that being strong meant not crying, that somehow he could hold his family together by holding himself together. Are you sure, Mama? He asked, his voice steady as a man's. Are you sure Papa's not just hurt real bad? Mary Catherine reached across the table and took his hand in hers. I'm sure, son. The telegram says they found Papa's body. He's with God now, and he can't come back to us. Baby Ruth looked from face to face, sensing the sadness in the air, even though she couldn't understand the words. She reached for Emma, making soft cooing sounds like she was trying to comfort her sister. They sat together in the morning light that streamed through Samuel's window, learning what it felt like to be a family with a hole in the middle of it. Mary Catherine held them all as close as she could, her arms not quite wide enough to gather all the pieces of their broken hearts. What happens now? Jacob asked after a long while. It was such a simple question, but it held everything. What happened to a family when the father died? What happened to children whose papa would never come home to hear about their day, or tuck them to bed, or teach them how to be brave in a world that could be cruel? Now we learn how to take care of each other, Mary Catherine said. We learn how to be sad together, and how to remember Papa together, and how to keep going even when it feels too hard. Emma wiped her nose on her nightgown sleeve. Will Papa know we miss him? He'll know, baby girl. Love doesn't die even when people do. Papa will always know how much we love him. The sun was fully up now, filling the kitchen with golden light that should have felt warm and hopeful. Instead, it illuminated their tears and the empty space where Samuel should have been sitting, reading his newspaper and planning the day's work. But they were still here, still breathing, still holding each other in the wreckage of their old life. And maybe that was enough for now. Maybe learning to be a family of 4 instead of 5 started with sitting together in the morning light, sharing their grief like they had once shared their joy. The day stretched out ahead of them, the first of many days they would have to face without Samuel. But they would face it together, these 3 children and their mother, bound by love that was stronger than death and sorrow that would teach them, slowly, how to carry on. 3 months had passed since the morning Mary Catherine spoke the words that changed everything, and the world had not ended. This surprised her more than anything else. She had expected the earth to stop turning, the sun to forget how to rise, the seasons to halt in their tracks. Instead, autumn had given way to winter, and winter had slowly, grudgingly begun to soften into spring. The children had learned to cry without shame and to laugh without guilt. Emma still asked questions about heaven and whether Papa could see the flowers she picked. Jacob had grown quieter but stronger, taking on chores that had once been Samuel's without being asked. Baby Ruth had started walking in those first terrible weeks after the news, as if she knew instinctively that the family needed her to grow up faster than planned. Mary Catherine had discovered muscles she didn't know she possessed, both in her arms and in her heart. The first month had been the hardest. She had moved through each day like someone walking underwater, every task requiring enormous effort. Getting out of bed, feeding the children, keeping the fire going, it all felt impossible until she did it anyway. But Millfield was the kind of place where neighbors didn't let widows struggle alone. Mrs. Henderson had appeared at her door the day after she told the children, carrying a pot of soup and staying to help with the washing. She hadn't said much, just worked beside Mary Catherine in comfortable silence, her presence saying what words could not. "You are not alone in this." Mr. Cooper had shown up the following week with his tools and his quiet way of fixing things. He mended the loose board on the front steps that Samuel had been meaning to get to. He patched the hole in the chicken coop roof and tightened the gate that had been sagging on its hinges. When Mary Catherine tried to thank him, he just touched the brim of his hat and said, "Samuel would have done the same for my family." The preacher's wife, Mrs. Garrett, had become a godsend. She would appear in the afternoons with her own children, taking Emma and Jacob to play, while Mary Catherine tended to Ruth or worked on the sewing that was slowly becoming their livelihood. Mrs. Garrett never offered empty comfort or tried to explain God's plan. She just showed up with practical help and the kind of friendship that didn't require many words. Word had gotten around about Mary Catherine's skill with a needle and thread. Samuel had always bragged that his wife could mend anything and make it look better than new. Now that skill was putting food on their table. She took in alterations and mending, working by lamplight after the children were asleep. Her fingers grew calloused in new places, and her back ached from bending over her work. But each coin she earned felt like a small victory against the uncertainty that had tried to swallow them whole. The little garden behind the house had become her sanctuary. Samuel had planted it in hope, dreaming of tomatoes and beans that would feed his family through the summer. Mary Catherine tended it in memory, her hands learning the feel of earth and growing things. The tomatoes had ripened in September, fat and red and sweet. Jacob had picked them with tears in his eyes, remembering his father's pride in the plants they had nurtured together. Now, as March warmed into April, she was preparing new ground for planting. The physical work of turning soil and pulling weeds helped quiet the restless ache in her chest. There was something healing about putting seeds into the earth and trusting that they would grow, even when you couldn't see them working their magic beneath the surface. Emma had become fascinated with the garden, following her mother around like a small shadow, asking endless questions about which plants would grow tallest and whether flowers had feelings like people did. Mary Catherine found herself answering with more patience than she had ever possessed before grief taught her that every moment with her children was precious. "Mama, can we plant something special for Papa?" Emma asked one morning, her small hands dirty from helping to prepare the seed beds. Mary Catherine paused in her digging, leaning on the hoe that had once been Samuel's. "What kind of special thing were you thinking, baby girl?" Emma's face scrunched up with the seriousness of deep thought. Something tall and pretty. Something he could see from heaven. The simplicity of it nearly broke Mary Catherine's heart all over again. Her 5-year-old daughter still believed that love could reach across the impossible distance between earth and sky, that a flower planted with good intentions might somehow bridge the gap between the living and the dead. "I think sunflowers would be perfect," Mary Catherine said, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "Papa always said sunflowers looked like pieces of the sun that decided to grow in gardens instead of staying in the sky." Emma clapped her hands together, sending dirt flying. "Yes. Can we plant them where Papa used to sit on the porch? In his favorite spot?" Mary Catherine looked toward the front of the house, where Samuel's chair still sat empty most evenings. She had thought about moving a dozen times, but somehow it felt wrong to erase that last visible sign of his presence. Maybe sunflowers would be better than emptiness. Maybe growing things could fill spaces that nothing else could touch. That afternoon, the whole family gathered on the front porch with a packet of sunflower seeds Mrs. Henderson had brought from town. Jacob helped dig the holes while Emma carefully counted out the seeds, her tongue poking out in concentration. Even baby Ruth contributed by patting the soil with her chubby hands and babbling encouragement to the invisible seeds. "When will they grow, Mama?" Emma asked as they finished covering the last seed with dirt. "It takes time, sweetie. Maybe a month or two before we see the first little green shoots. And then most of the summer before they're tall and bright like real sunflowers." Jacob wiped his hands on his pants and looked at the patch of freshly turned earth with the same serious expression he brought to all his responsibilities. That's a long time away. Mary Catherine smoothed his hair with her earth-stained fingers. Good things usually take time to grow. That's what makes them worth waiting for. As the weeks passed and spring settled fully into the countryside around Millfield, the sunflower seeds began their secret work beneath the soil. Mary Catherine found herself checking the spot every morning, looking for the first signs of green that would mean their faith in the future had been rewarded. The children had settled into new routines that made room for both sadness and joy. Emma still cried sometimes when she missed her papa, but she also laughed at the antics of the new kittens that had appeared in their barn. Jacob had taken over many of his father's chores with a quiet pride that made Mary Catherine's heart swell with love and worry in equal measure. Ruth was becoming a toddler with opinions and a vocabulary that grew every day, most of which seemed to involve the word no, said with great conviction. Mary Catherine's sewing business had grown beyond mending and alterations. Mrs. Henderson had commissioned a dress for her daughter's wedding, and word of Mary Catherine's skill had spread to neighboring farms. She was even teaching Emma simple stitches on scraps of fabric, the way her own mother had taught her when she was small. The loneliness still came in waves, usually in the quiet moments after the children were asleep. She would sit in the kitchen with her mending and remember conversations she had shared with Samuel in this same lamplight. She would hear his laugh and the sound of wind through the eaves, catch glimpses of his profile in Jacob's growing face, feel the ghost of his hand on her shoulder when she was struggling with a difficult stitch. But alongside the loneliness came something unexpected, a fierce pride in what she was building. She was raising 3 children alone and doing it well. She was keeping food on their table and a roof over their heads. She was teaching them that loss was not the end of love, that families could be broken and still be strong, that hope could grow even in ground that had been torn up by grief. One morning in May, Emma came running into the house with dirt on her nightgown and excitement lighting up her face like sunrise. "Mama, Mama, come see. The sunflowers are coming up." Mary Catherine followed her daughter outside, her heart beating faster than it had in months. There, in the patch of earth where Samuel used to sit and watch the evening sky, tiny green shoots were pushing up through the soil like small miracles. They were barely an inch tall, fragile as hope itself, but they were real and growing and reaching toward the light. Emma danced around the shoots, careful not to step on them, her joy infectious enough to make Jacob smile and baby Ruth clap her hands. "Look, Mama, Papa's sunflowers are growing." Mary Catherine knelt beside the emerging plants, touching the soil gently with her fingertips. Samuel would never see these flowers bloom. He would never sit in his chair again, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and pink. But his children were growing too, reaching toward their own light in ways he had helped teach them. "They're beautiful," she said, and meant it. As the summer stretched ahead of them, full of possibilities and uncertainties in equal measure, Mary Catherine knew they would tend these sunflowers together. They would water them during dry spells and stake them up when they grew tall. They would watch them turn their faces toward the sun each day, following light with the same instinct that was slowly teaching her family how to find joy again. The seeds had been planted in broken ground, but broken didn't mean barren. Sometimes the earth had to be torn up before new things could grow. Sometimes families had to learn how to be different before they could learn how to be whole again. And sometimes love planted in the right place could bloom into something even more beautiful than what had been lost, growing tall and bright enough to be seen from heaven itself.